Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for your patience while we organize chairs. I can't tell you how delighted we are that we had more of you than we expected. So thanks for coming. My name is Penny Wright. I want to thank, first of all, our partners in many program offerings, Southampton Historical Museum, headed by Tom Edmonds, whom some of you know. They are wonderful partners, and we have a way of sharing venues and sharing ideas, and it just works out really well. A couple of things that are, I'm not going to say too much, but I do want to say a couple of things. First of all, if you live outside of our library district and do not get our newsletter, please take a newsletter over on the table. We have lots going on. It's just a July newsletter. And we have a lot more going on in August. And several of those August programs are on flyers on the table. And we really care about them. And people don't know about them yet. So please take a look. We have a little July calendar and an August calendar, and you can take one of those as well. There are 3 or 4 things that are coming up very soon in which we are partnering with the Southampton Historical Museum. One should be a wonderful program about the American First Lady. This is part 1, 1933 to 1963. That is here. Do let us know if you can that you're coming, because we love those numbers. Stories of Old Southampton, which will be at the Halsey House on August 2nd. A program about the Irish coming to New York, and that's in August, on August 15th, right here in this room. And the last thing we're doing for the immediate future is a program which should be really fun. A lot of people have signed up already. This is called America's Irish Aristocracy, Tales of the Buckleys, Bradys, Kennedys, Ryans, and Southampton's own Murrays and McDonalds. That's on July 19th, and I think some of you have already signed up for that. So, of course, the reason we're here today is to have a chat with one of our favorite people, authors, Mary Cummings. And we have had a long association with Mary here at the library. She was very involved in the library's oral history program for a number of years. She is currently the manager of the Southampton Historical Museum Research Center, and she's written 3 books on local history. Her articles have appeared in numerous publications, including Time Out New York, Newsday, and the New York Times, where she was a regular contributor for 10 years to its Long Island coverage. For 7 years, she was an associate editor, feature writer, and columnist at the Southampton Press, and in the view of many, she was the best feature writer they have ever had at that newspaper. She grew up in Southampton, and we were sort of neighbors, weren't we, Mary? She attended Southampton schools and holds a bachelor's degree from Smith College and a master's degree from Stony Brook University. After living in France, Ethiopia, and Barbados, as well as in several American cities, she and her husband moved to Bridgehampton, where they raised her 2 sons. Now, she has the distinction, I'm sure, of being the only person in the room who has 2 sons who are here in this room. So, Orson and Ben, who are filmmakers, so we're happy to have them here as well. Now Mary is living in close proximity to her family and to the Southampton Historical Museum, and she is very pleased to have finished this wonderful book, which, by the way, if you have not read it, you have an opportunity to check it out in the library, or better yet, to buy a copy, because Southampton Books very kindly sent Hannah over with some books to sell. It reads like a novel and is just a fantastic book. So please welcome Mary Cummings.
that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's amazing. I'm a little overwhelmed. But I thought I would start by explaining what possessed me to spend several years of my life writing this book. I think like a lot of people, I've always been fascinated by the Gilded Age. Maybe more so because I grew up in Southampton, which, as you know, is a fashionable resort and has been a fashionable resort ever since the Gilded Age. I also have a personal connection with the Gilded Age in Southampton. At the end of the 19th century, my great-grandparents ran a boarding house on Toilsome Lane. The story I was always told was that Dr. T. Guyow Thomas approached my great-grandparents and asked if they would be willing to expand the farmhouse, because it was then a farm, to accommodate some of his patients from New York City who would benefit from the salubrious ocean air in the summer. They agreed, and the house grew up and out, and by the time my family, including my sister Laura, were spending our summers there, the boarding house was of course long gone, but it had 40 rooms. Most of them had been abandoned to the dust, but they were still furnished as they had been for the boarders, with their carved bedsteads and their slop jars and everything the boarders would have needed. So that is my connection with Gilded Age Southampton. Living there was extremely interesting, a lot of fun, and a little bit haunting. So that interest in the Gilded Age, I think almost inevitably led me to an interest in Stanford White. White did not have a summer cottage in Southampton, but he did have a lot of friends in Southampton, and a few lucky ones got one of his most beautiful cottages in the shingle style. I always admired them most. He did have a lot of friends and spent a lot of time out here. So my first idea was to focus on the Southampton summer colony and on White and on two of his most interesting friends. One of them was Charles Barney, which is probably an unfamiliar name to you. It was not the famous one, but he was very well known in his time in New York as a financial wizard. A wild speculator and a very successful one, so he made a big fortune and had a beautiful house on Lake Agawam, and it didn't hurt that he also married the sister of William Collins Whitney, who was arguably the most powerful and richest man in the city. But the second friend who I was going to focus on, and who remains very much in the book, was James Breeze. And James Breeze was a very good friend of Stanford White's. He had an impeccable lineage. He was from a real old New York family, but he always refused to behave the way his rank would have had him behave. He was a bohemian soul, and he loved a party, as did White, especially a costume party. And he was an artist. He made a name for himself as an amateur photographer, mostly of beautiful women, but he was very good. He introduced some new technology to photography, and he always wanted to be first with everything that was happening. So he experimented with radio when it was in its infancy, and he had one of the very first automobiles in Southampton. However, as I delved into my research, I realized that really all the fun stuff was happening in New York City. that is where White and, like lots of wealthy men, wealthy married men of his class, was leading a double life. He and his friends were enjoying all the pleasures of Gilded Age Gotham, which at that time was a thoroughly corrupt city. It was under Tammany rule, and it was a city that had a very, very high tolerance for the indulgences of very rich men. The dedicated hedonist at that time could find anything he craved in what was being called Sin City, especially in the bohemian, notorious neighborhood that was known as the Tenderloin. The Tenderloin occupied several blocks in Midtown Manhattan, and it was chock full of dives and cheap theater and music halls and gambling dens and brothels. So when White and his friends were not called upon to attend some high society function, because they were all in high society and led these double lives as family men during the day and on weekends, and as carousing companions many evenings. So you could find them in the Tenderloin, you could find White, usually accompanied by one or more of the beautiful young women who were flocking to the city at that time to make a name for themselves on stage, and failing that, to marry a millionaire. So another thing that White and his friends really enjoyed was orchestrating extravagant stag parties. White and Breeze co-hosted one. They were always secret, and they were held in one or another of the secret studios that these men rented around town for such functions. But in one occasion, the secret leaked, and the public was shocked to find out what went on at these parties. So the first thing I'm going to read from the book is about what became known as the Pie Girl Dinner. On that occasion, White, his old friend and carousing companion Jimmy Breeze, and Henry Poor had hosted a stag dinner in Breeze's photography studio, which had been lavishly decorated by White. Served by scantily clad young women, some 50 or so men had ingested Rabelaisian quantities of food and drink, a 13-course meal, gallons of wine, and 144 bottles of champagne. When it came time for dessert, a huge pie was wheeled out, and out of which popped a flock of birds and a nearly nude underage girl. Though every effort had been made to keep the revels secret, word of the scandalous Pie Girl dinner had leaked, and White had been obliged to go hat in hand to his friends in the press and implore them not to publish the story. While others had complied, Pulitzer had not, and the world had blasted, quote, the bacchanalian revels in New York's fashionable studios, unquote, and excoriated men who would corrupt young girls for their pleasure. So I had my setting, which was rich with possibilities. And then I made a discovery which prompted me to add another character to my story, a very interesting character who became actually quite central to the whole story. I discovered a biography of the swashbuckling anti-corruption crusader William Travers Jerome. He was a contemporary of White's, which of course lured me. Jerome was disgusted with the lawlessness that prevailed in New York City and just champing at the bit to get out there and sweep up the city and clean it up. The problem was that he was stuck on what he called a squirt court, a minor court where he was frustrated by being unable to carry out his plans. So one day, he did something totally unprecedented and shocking. He threw off his judicial robes, he blazed up from the bench, he organized a crew of axe-wielding men and went on a raid in downtown New York on one of the illicit gambling joints. It was supposed to be top secret because if it weren't, then the corrupt police were going to tip off the target. However, somehow, and it may have been Jerome himself who alerted the press, but they got wind of it and it was thoroughly covered, this raid, by the press. And the excerpt I'm going to read now is based on a very detailed account of the raid that appeared in the New York Times. Night after night, Jerome has continued to storm his targets, risking his life alongside his men, always trailed by reporters and photographers whose reward for their high-risk participation has been a steady stream of sensational copy. Robert Dunn, then a reporter for the Commercial Advertiser, later recalled that he seldom came so close to death as when he accompanied Jerome on his raiding parties. On one occasion, during a raid on a joint disguised behind the silken drapes of a milliner's shop, lookouts took several pot shots at Jerome, narrowly missing him and the young Mr. Dunn. Customary procedure was to, quote, rush the joint, which usually involved hacking down doors and engaging in a free fight that sometimes climaxed with gunfire. Then, in minutes, it would all be over. A truck would arrive at the door to load on the roulette wheels and other paraphernalia as, quote, the pistol smoke cleared from the rear fire escape. To Boss Croker, he was boss of Tammany Hall, to Croker's frustration, Jerome's celebrity has increased with each report of another hair-raising raid. Passionate reformists rejoice in his give-em-hell attitude, his willingness to push the limits of his judicial authority, abandon accepted protocol, and offend the powerful. For the oppressed in the tenements, resentful of the rich while they live in wretched conditions under Tammany rule, he is a hero, hailed for his fearless attacks on the status quo, and praised for finally trying to hold the elites to account. Less enthusiastic are many of Jerome's social peers, especially those in William Whitney's circle of uptown clubmen and captains of industry, who are not apt to dwell on the plight of the poor or the evils of gambling. Content with and deeply invested in the status quo, they view Jerome and his inconvenient crusade with alarm. Jerome, who scorned for the hard-hearted privilege is well known, remains unconcerned. If they are grumbling over their whiskeys in the cushioned luxury of the Metropolitan Club, disparaging his reckless methods and unreliability as a defender of their interests, so much the better. In the book, I alternate chapters between the high-living celebrity Stanford White and the swashbuckling lawman William Travers Jerome. And while Jerome is conducting his hair-raising raids and pursuing a whole roster of unscrupulous but very colorful crooks, White too has a mission, a double mission. He is very anxious to liberate New York City from what he considered its drab provincialism. And he tackles that with his luminous buildings and his impressive landmarks like the Washington Square Arch, and they are very helpful in brightening the city. The other part of his mission is to free New Yorkers from the suffocating, he thinks, moral code that was inherited from previous generations. And not unrelated to that mission, he is also about to embark on the most passionate and costly affair of his life with the beautiful young showgirl Evelyn Nesbit, the it girl of her era. He waits a while, but on a day in September 1901, he and Evelyn meet for the first time. He has invited a friend of Evelyn's, another chorus girl, to bring Evelyn to his 24th Street hideaway for a luncheon. And I will read a bit about how that first meeting went. Despite his meticulous planning, White's imposing size and galvanic personality do not work in his favor at first. Evelyn will recall that her first impression was that White was, quote, not a bit handsome. To put her at ease, White has invited his friend Reginald Runs to make a party of 4. White adopts a fatherly manner, indulging Evelyn with her first taste of champagne, but limiting her to only 1 glass. He is rewarded when she begins to enjoy herself, pleased and flattered by the frank admiration of the 2 men, even more intoxicating than the wine. Appealing to the child that Evelyn has not quite outgrown, White surprises her with his playful exuberance, his powerful laugh delivered as he throws his head back and lets loose. He does nothing to disguise his infatuation. After lunch and the departure of Reginald Ronald, White takes the girls upstairs to yet another fantasy room where Evelyn's wonder at the extraordinary red velvet swing suspended from the high ceiling is just what he had hoped for. He urges her to climb on, and as she grips the red ropes entwined with smilax, he pushes her higher and higher until her foot pierces a giant Japanese paper parasol hung from the ceiling, and they both laugh so hard she complains that her sides ache. Not long after that, White shows Evelyn his darker side. She is not always the most reliable witness to her own story. But what seems to have happened is that she visited White alone one evening at his 24th Street hideaway, and he encouraged her to drink a whole lot of wine, possibly spiked, and when she woke up the next morning in his bed, she was no longer a virgin. She was, of course, traumatized at first. She was 16, he was 47, but he was very practiced and soothed her and pleaded with her and made promises. And in the end, he convinced her that her best course was just to stay with the relationship. Meanwhile, waiting in the wings to capture Evelyn when the affair with White ended, as it inevitably would, was the mentally unbalanced, fabulously wealthy, young Harry K. Thaw. Thaw had arrived in New York confident that he could crash New York society by buying into it and live among the Fifth Avenue swells. That was not going to happen. And it was not going to happen because of his own erratic behavior, and worse, he was a pervert, and he had outbursts of violence, and at one point he tried to enter the Union League Club on horseback up the stairs and into the But he was convinced that people were snubbing him because White had blackballed him from all the elite clubs in New York, which were absolutely necessary to enter society. And so he blamed White, and he was obsessed with anger against White. And he was also obsessed with Evelyn, whom he, with the idea of marrying her and having the prize that White had once had. Funnily enough, or tragically enough, he did succeed in marrying Evelyn in 1905, which seems very hard to accept. But she was on her own at that point. She was terrified of growing old in poverty. And she had always dreamed of a life of travel and luxury. She deluded herself into thinking that because Thaw was so enamored of her, she could control him, and they would lead a married life along the lines of what she had dreamed. So he took care of that obsession, and then he took care of the other one in a very sensational way. In June of 1906, he murdered Stanford White in the roof garden theater of the old original Madison Square Garden, which White had designed. There was White in a pool of blood, and the story then never left the front pages of the newspaper as preparations for his murder trial progressed. The whole world, not just this country, but the whole world was riveted on the news from that about the trial and the preparations, and everything they could learn about the cast of characters. Jerome, the prosecutor, because he was the DA. Thaw, the accused. Evelyn, the accused's wife and the defense's star witness. And Stanford White, whose presence, even in death, hovered over the courtroom. So I'm going to show you what a big deal it was. I'm going to read something about the beginnings of the trial. When the trial opens on January 23rd in the Criminal Courts Building before Judge James Fitzgerald, there can be no doubt that this is to be a mammoth media event. With the sins of the rich as its main theme, the trial has electrified the public, but spectators have been barred from the courtroom. To keep them informed, 100 reporters from papers all over the world have been assigned to cover the trial. A Western Union telegraph office has been installed in the main hall, and a great cable of wires descends from the city skylight. 100 policemen have been assigned to keep order. During the tedious business of questioning 600 prospective jurors who are to be sequestered for the first time in history, reporters fill their notebooks with detailed descriptions of the scene in the packed courtroom and deliver a daily flood of florid prose to their readers. The somber procession of Thaw family members into the courtroom is rich with descriptive possibilities. The dowager matriarch, quote, veiled and dressed in unrelieved black, unquote, leads the way, followed by her daughter, the Countess of Yarmouth, quote, a pretty young woman with a tip-tilted nose, and an absent husband. The Count de Money, to whom she had been married, is reportedly in Monte Carlo, and rumors of a separation are quickly followed by talk of an annulment. Mrs. George Carnegie, the Countess's rather plain sister, gets less attention, and all eyes turn to the tiny figure of the murderer's stricken wife, a deathly pale and hollow-eyed Evelyn. Jerome strides into the courtroom, confident that a brilliant performance will be the crowning achievement of his tenure as district attorney and will pave the way for his political rise. He is already ready to announce his candidacy for governor of New York, and he is quite confident. At one point, he even boasted that when he got Evelyn in the witness chair, he would tear her limb from limb. Of course, now I am hoping that you will all want to know how the trial plays out. Will Jerome live up to his notices as the greatest cross-examiner of his time? Will Evelyn, with her fragile beauty and her acting skills, turn the heads of the jurors to the point where they will consider the facts irrelevant? And will Thaw, with his armies of lawyers and all of his money, succeed with a defense that portrays him as a hero for having rid the country of a monstrous sexual predator? So you'll need to read. But in closing, I'd like to say that as I wrote this book, I was struck by how many of the issues of 100 years ago are still with us today. Of course, here in Southampton, we are very well placed to witness the behavior of the super rich, flaunting their wealth and building ever bigger houses that rival the size of those of the great piles of the Gilded Age. We also have our own version of the financial manipulations and insider trading that built so many Gilded Age fortunes. And whenever someone comes along in the mold of Jerome, boldly attacking the men that Jerome called the criminal rich, they don't do any better usually than Jerome did. In fact, if you think of U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, who was the last person I can think of who did that, he was fired promptly as soon as President Trump was able to do that. And then, of course, there are the revelations of the Me Too movement, which show that the patriarchal attitudes that led White to believe that he could just consider every woman fair game in his frenzied pursuit of sexual encounters, that has not been eradicated yet. And the question remains, can you separate the art from the artist? I don't think very many people would deny that White played a major role in transforming New York City into the dazzling city it is today. But he was not a moral man. He had no respect for traditional morality, and in fact, he did not think that sex was a moral matter. He was full of life. He was generous with his friends. He was charming and cultured, and people were drawn to him. I was drawn to him as I was writing the book, and maybe you will be drawn to him in reading it. But he had a much darker side, which cannot be ignored. So I leave on that slightly sour note.
Would you take questions, Mary?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer.
I have a question. Just, you know, the Breeze name in your book.
Right.
Wasn't there a Frances Breeze?
There was, yeah.
How was she related to?
Frances Breeze, I actually knew, which
Okay.
reveals something, but she was his daughter.
She was his daughter.
She was his daughter. She wrote a memoir in 3 volumes, and one of the things she described in that memoir was the sight of Stanford White on his back, on the scaffolding in the music room of the James Breeze estate, which is now, of course, Whitefield's
Right.
condominiums, giving instructions to the Italian painters who were painting the ceiling.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Mary, the other name, when I was reading your book, was Canfield, of course. Now, I remember there was Franklin Canfield, who lived on Gin Lane when we were growing up. Do you think he was related to the Canfield in your book?
I wonder. That would be interesting to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Canfield was a very successful, posh gambling house, Fifth Avenue gambling house owner who catered to the rich crowd. Big numbers.
Paul, you mentioned he arrived on the scene very wealthy. Where did his money come from?
His family, his father, who tried to minimize his inheritance, but the mother was doting and that went by the boards. But the father had been in coal and in railroads and made a huge fortune, and they had a huge, ugly house in Pittsburgh.
I thought they pleaded insanity as his defense.
He did in the second. The first ended in a mistrial because the mother did not want the family escutcheon to be tainted by insanity. But by the second trial, they knew they had to admit he was insane.
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Give it away.
That was a mistake. You tricked me.
So, Mary, next book?
I'm taking a vacation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you, I don't even know, how did you discover the Jerome biography, which led you to?
Probably in the library. Yes. Yeah.
Where did you do your research?
Well, couldn't have done it before the internet. I did it because in the old newspapers, which are online. Yeah. So I had original documents, but on the screen. Yeah.
Mary, there's a question here.
Some people called it Sin City. Yes, it was a real destination for vice. Yeah.
Hi. Did Robert Jerome have any connection with
Yes, that's a very interesting point. William Travers Jerome's father and his father's brother were very famous wags, they called them then, and had ups and downs on Wall Street, but they married sisters, and unfortunately for William Travers, who they always called Travers in the family, his father married this very moralistic, deadly woman, and was no fun. But the uncle, Travers Jerome's uncle, married the other sister, who was a live wire, and their daughter was Jenny, and she married Churchill. So Churchill was William Travers Jerome's cousin. Okay.
Wait,
Why do you suppose that it's such a sensational story, even in this moment, that the story was left alone, and that you, congratulations by the way, picked up this story, decided to tell it, but it really was left alone for a long time?
Yeah, it has endured. I think partly because it obviously would not have been that exciting to people if it didn't revolve around Stanford White, who left a legacy. I mean, Jerome left no legacy, and he's forgotten. Well, he did leave a little legacy, but still, it's not the kind that excites people. But we have all these reminders of White, and after, being reviled for a very long time, now his professional reputation has, I think, been more or less restored.
So you think that it was his reputation that sort of is why people didn't want the story to be, I mean, even explored in really detailed nonfiction.
Right, yeah. Well, he's just a fascinating character, and the Gilded Age is a fascinating era, and it's a fascinating story.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
sounds like a movie to me.
It was
Oh, it was?
It was,
right on the Velvet Swing.
yeah, a long time ago, in the 50s.
When did it go now?
Joan Collins.
Okay?